Started.
Okay, so Merry Christmas to everyone. And in keeping with the Christmas spirit, I thought we could talk about Santa Claus. And I'm going to just start. I'm going to bring my notes out here. I've just only a few because the rest it's just emblazoned in the little gray cells. But if I were to say what would be the number one takeaway of the whole discussion here, it would be to keep rent free in your brain that Santa Claus is what happens with a living egregore, as opposed to one which has departed. And when an egregore perishes, it's when it's left only to memory, and there's nothing actively engaged in its constant reinforcement. Santa Claus is amazing. He has become this like confluence or conglomeration of multiple different narrative threads, kind of all bound together until we have the Santa Claus of today. And the thing that's been the most fascinating to me about his transition has been from going to this elderly Saint Nicholas, who was literally a Catholic saint who was known for giving out gifts to the poor. My favorite association with him has to do with providing a dowry for three young women so the father didn't have to sell them into slavery. And so he had to sneak into the house. And this is where Saint Nick sneaks into your house to give you a gift. That's like the origin point of that story. It was to make sure these young women had enough of a dowry that they didn't have to be sold into slavery. Really cute story. But we go from that to the movie with oh darn, I forget his name now. I had it in the tip of my tongue. He was the sheriff from Stranger Things. Anyway, he plays
Oh,
Santa Claus in Violent Night. And
yeah.
and talk about an epic Christmas movie. Like that is a complete transmutation of Santa Claus, where as a living entity, we've gone from my childhood, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer and Santa's coming to town with the little, stop motion stuff, to a guy just cutting people down and being a legendary warrior. And possibly, if you follow a lot of the modern novelizations, things when you look at books like the Dresden Files or the Deadwood series or stuff like that, these are all just like leisure books that you can read about modern wizardry. And a lot of times they carry with them the updated version of a lot of fairy tales or mythologies or things like that. So in the case of Santa Claus, there's been this movement to recapture his identity as Odin and the god of the hunt. And the way you can tie yourself to that is look at symbolic representations that lead you to that. The So let's just look really quick at Santa Claus and his accoutrement. Okay, as Batman says in the Nolan version when he's kind of hunched over and he's talking to his girlfriend and he's like, it's not um, what I say that defines me, it's what I do. And so with Santa Claus, it's what does he do and what is he wearing and what is he driving? Like, how does all that speak to his person? To help us follow where a lot of modern storytellers, because they're the ones who have custody of Santa Claus, are going with Santa because he's been expanded. And there's a reason why it's important that Santa Claus keeps getting expansions. And there are a bunch of real short but decent YouTube videos that kind of give you like the brief history of Santa. And almost always they point out that at the early part of the 20th century, in keeping with a lot of retail stuff, Santa Claus, was getting fully developed so that one particular author, again, name escapes me, but he had developed the idea that Santa comes from Santa Town and that he has elves that build the toys year round and that he literally fleshed all this out. And the reason that's important is because it gives you the substrate and structure of your egregore so that it can stay alive in the imaginations of the people that serve it. because we serve the Santa egregore, and in turn, its spirit that it embodies, the spirit of Christmas giving, then comes back to us, and then we embody that spirit and share it with others. So that's this like circular thing that comes when we're dealing with an egregore. So all right, so now that you've got all that foundation, when we're looking at Santa, the first thing that draws to my attention is the 8 reindeer and his sleigh, because this is reminiscent of a chariot. And as we know, when we're looking at, let's see, yep, it's right over there. So we can do, let's see, share screen. And we'll just pop that one up because that's a good one. And there we go. So when we're looking at the tree of life, and by the way, before we go any farther at all, here's something that for me is really important. As I've worked as a symbologist, as an anthropologist, or just, as a person who studies mythology and looks at human culture and does cross-cultural analysis of where all these cultures are and what they're thinking or looking at, you'll find that because ideas are getting updated or changed over time, like with Santa Claus, it can become very confusing. Certain properties that traditionally were associated with something else entirely are now attached to this thing, and it doesn't necessarily make sense because we're not in on the group that decided that this would become an aspect of the modern interpretation. A classic example of this that always gets under my saddle as a burr is the idea that vampires are vulnerable to silver. That literally is a construct of the last 30 years or so, and it started in the 90s. But prior to that, in fact, so much so that there was a movie with Bronson, I think it was. Anyway, he's the really tan actor, and he plays a vampire, and the love interest in that movie, wanting to defend his girlfriend, goes into a restaurant and shoots him with silver bullets. And then he laughs and he says, haha, that's werewolves, not vampires, idiot. And, so back in the 80s, that was still a thing. And then in the 90s, suddenly vampires were vulnerable to silver thanks to Blade and other, like Buffy and stuff. And I really never understood why that was, and I still don't. But that's part of what happens with a living egregore. Vampires and werewolves are still very much alive in the consciousness of writers, storytellers, and fans, and therefore they will change with the time. Another example of this, going into a classic example, a really obscure reference, but some of you will look it up later, would be the wolf god Wep-Wawet. Okay. And this was the patron god of the Lycopolis, or wolf city in northern Africa and Egypt. If I were to pick a place where werewolves would come from, the Lycopolis would be the place in ancient Egyptian history that I would say, hey, this is where that's from. And the reason why I'm tying that together is because the silver thing in modern thinking ties vampirism back to Judas Iscariot. And so because Judas betrayed Christ over 30 pieces of silver, therefore he's vulnerable to silver, right? So that's where that thought process comes from. In Wep-Wawet's case, he went from someone who led the pack, and keep in mind this will be important in a second. You'll see where I'm going with it. And he was a pack leader, and then later he was considered an opener of the way. And then after that, he kind of got absorbed by Anubis, so that he was a caretaker of the dead. And then finally, he just kind of disappears. So that's what happens with a lot of egregores. And when you're studying mythology, this can get really frustrating because now you have to ask yourself, what period of time am I looking at where they're defining it like this? Because as I go farther back into history, like a paleontologist goes down into the sediment sample, you'll get different versions of the same god, like Wep-Wawet, okay? Now, the other day I posted, maybe it was this morning, I can't remember, but I reposted that Harry Heroes video, and the idea behind that was The hairy heroes are associated most frequently with characters like Mars, the Mars archetype. That's why wolves and Mars are tied together. So, and Mars is red. So just remember that. This is where in your brain, when you do astrohistory, you're going to feel a little bit like one of those crazy people, you know, who have like the lines in their bedroom going off to all the different pictures, and they're like, and this is connected to that, and this is, well, that's my brain with mythology, where I can see all the things, and I'm saying, what are the guys carrying? What are they doing? How are they aspected? If it's a red wolf, then that reminds me of Mars. And Rudolph then might be tied to that same aspect. A red-nosed reindeer would be the opener of the way for Santa Claus during bad weather, right? And of course, it's a pack leader. And now let's get back to Santa Claus. But just remember that because Wep-Wawet is also tied with the hunt. Okay, so Santa Claus and Odin, which is where we're going to go with this, because you could draw a lot of characterizations with Santa Claus, but really it seems like if I were to pick anything, then Santa Claus is tied to the Odinic mythology, and specifically, I would think that it would be Odin. So here's the reasons. And although Odin is clad in Mars archetype wear, so it gets a little confusing. It could still be Mars, but here's the deal. Mars, the Sun, and Jupiter are all gods of war, so they all have a history of being veterans at one point or another. Mars is the god of war because that is his sole vocation pretty much all the time, whereas Jupiter and the Sun are war gods, meaning that they engaged in wars with the other gods, but may not necessarily have been a god of war. Okay, so in the case of Santa being Odin, there's a couple keys to this. One, the original Santa Claus, at least in association with like Dutch mythologies, used to have a smaller character with him named Black Pete. That's now totally politically incorrect and very insensitive, and anyone who mentions it immediately is going to get in trouble these days. But Black Pete was the guy who would kidnap children who were bad and stick coal in their socks if they were bad. And he was a horrible. Fairy tales back in the day were awful. Almost all of them were just awful, like all of them, because I got to hear the originals because I grew up part-time in Holland. So my grandmother would tell me, like, okay, Cinderella, most of you are unaware, but the sisters who were the stepsisters to fit into the shoe amputated parts of their feet to get them in. It's a really grisly story. You should check it out. I know there's blood everywhere. And they were telling me these stories as a little kid, so it probably twisted my mind in one way or another. But the idea with Odin being tied with the hunt and being tied with uh, an animal of the hunt can be seen in the reindeer. The reindeer are tied to the goddess Diana, who is a goddess of the hunt. And so those animals are sacred to her and would be a component of conveyance. In this case, the sleigh then facilitates the function of a chariot, but it's a very unique chariot because it's capable of going everywhere and being anywhere at any time because that's part of the bag of tricks that Santa Claus has, is that he's able to be in all places or any place at any time that he desires or focuses on. It's how he gets around the earth in one night. It's because for him, there are moments and then there are spaces between the moments, and then there are spaces between the moments of the moments, and there's a lot of operational space to work with when you're Santa Claus getting things done. He's not actually working any faster. He's just optimizing the vibratory distance between moments that happen from space to space. And all of that's capable and discussed in the chariot card of the tarot, which is fixed in one place, but is in all places at all times. So that's his thing. It's drawn by 8 reindeer. Now, why 8? 8 is associated with the sphere of Hod, which is ruled by Mercury. So here's another god who's known for speed. So you get the chariot, which can be in all places at all times, driven by 8 animals, signifying the speed at which that can happen, which is essentially instantaneous. Because Mercury, as messenger of the gods, is essentially conveying thought between one god and another, right? On an electrical level. He's boom. He is the God that enlightens, truly enlightens our intellect from moment to moment, which is why he is a God of air and thought and the messenger. So the 8 reindeer then combined into one reminds me of Sleipnir, which is the 8-legged horse of Odin. So you just take Sleipnir, 8-legged horse, which obviously allows Odin to be where? Everywhere he wants to be, as fast as he needs to be, because it's Sleipnir. So, and then you put that in front of a chariot, and now you've got Santa Claus's his method of conveyance, which takes him right down the pillar of severity on this side. Okay. Now, just remember, just because someone works on one side of the tree doesn't mean that's where they live. It just means that's where they work. How do you figure this out? It's identified by your hands. When your hands are crossed like this over your chest, right? And so that each hand, your right hand is over your left shoulder and your left hand is over your right shoulder, and you are now at rest. This position is called Osiris at rest. Esoterically, it means that you're sitting right, you're completely at rest. If you divide yourself up into 3 pillars, then your right side would be black, the center of you would be gray, and your left would be white. And your right hand then would be white and your left hand would be black. So when you become active, this separates. So they live here, but they work there. So as they work on the opposite pillars. So it allows for you to break things up or stabilize things. So the static of the pillar of severity, the black pillar, is brought into active focus, penetrating focus by the penetrating masculine power of the right hand. And the chaotic uh, side of the masculine projective on the left is brought into focus by the ordered structure of the sacred feminine on the left. So projection and reception. The point of that analogy is just to point out that just because Santa Claus is working full time on the pillar of severity doesn't mean that's where he lives. It's still Odin by virtue of all the other things that he's bringing with him, specifically like the idea of Sleipnir functioning as his ride, the idea of Diana, the goddess of hunt, being a patron who supplies him the animals with which he can have conveyance. There, there is one thing I guess that would really help, and it's kind of a paradigm shift on the seasons, which will help pretty much anyone get a grasp on mythologically where things stand. Mythologically, while it is nice to break the seasons up into 4 quadrants and have spring, summer, autumn, and winter, the truth is nature divides itself in a binary way. So when you look at the seasons, you can see an annual season essentially. Um, when you look at the seasons, you can see an annual season mirroring a lunar season or a daily season. And by season, I mean from start to finish. The sun rises, is at its apex, then descends, then is at nadir, then goes back to equilibrium, and then back up to apex. And we see this from dawn to dusk. We see this in the lunar cycle as the moon waxes and wanes. And we see this in a solar cycle where the sun waxes and wanes, going from solstice to solstice. I mention this because we're moving into the winter solstice. And when you consider the seasonal aspect of the earth really just dividing between summer and winter, it opens up a whole volume of esoteric understanding when you're looking at fairy tales, which then can give you an understanding of other things. Because the key is You always want to run back home to mama, as it were. And for me, that's the tree of life. It has certain spheres which have certain jobs and certain names associated with them. And then I use that as base foundation of, okay, this is my base key code. And then from there, I build on that. Okay, this god uses an eagle. Eagles are tied to the military and to other aspects. And I might eventually get myself all the way to G.I. Joe, and that Joseph, who was sold into Egypt, might be the same Joe as a G.I. Joe. Like that they're all tied symbolically into the same sort of cluster. And then I have to ask myself about who's the green man. And we've talked about, the fact that Jupiter is a variable star, very likely, and that it's in past, it simply went through various spectrums of light, growing and dimming over time. Back to Santa Claus. So, and seasons. So when you think of the seasons then as divided in two instead of divided in four, then it kind of makes things a little bit more sensible, because then the equinoxes represent transition points of power. They represent the only point in the year where power is perfectly balanced between light and darkness, and affords itself a unique opportunity to engage in certain work personally, because that only happens once a year, one way and the other, and it informs you about certain things with mythological structures, like, for instance, Jesus Christ being crucified between two thieves. Who could the thieves be? Well, one thief on the right could be one who steals light and gives it to the darkness, and the other could be one who steals the light from the darkness, and gives it to the light, the seasons. So who's gathering up the light? Well, in that instance of the crucifixion, one was cursed and one was blessed. And my gut guess is the guy who was stealing light and saving it up was probably the one who got the blessing, because they were taking it away from the darkness. But the going back to Santa Claus, I know we've touched on a bunch of stuff, but this happens when you're working with a kind of esoteric schmackdown. You'll see all these different associations and symbolisms tied together and pooling together. Um, and as we keep them organized by using the tree and using that as like a foundation for correspondence, we can help ourselves from going astray. Like, because it's really easy. It's really easy to misguess one of these and go in the wrong direction. And I've done that so often. That's why I'm at this point, after a couple of decades of this, I get really hesitant, because the modern interpretations of certain things are changing. If I were to go back, 20 years ago and say, hey, Santa Claus is this warrior representation of Odin, on a, off day. And the reason his garment is red is because it's awash in the blood of his enemies and the hunt. And he's an aspect of the wild hunt during winter, which represents savagery, because the winter court is one that is passionate and savage. It's all the elements of cold and darkness. And think about winter. We're here, it's not exactly sunshine, flowers, and roses. That's the other side of the year. In winter court, it's harshness and severity, and only the strong survive. In the summertime, it's a different kind of harshness and severity. Now, but because of the growth and everything is now competing. They both mirror each other, and they both contrast with each other. And recognizing Santa Claus as a vassal of the winter court then makes it kind of fun, or at least a lord, certainly, at least in his function as Santa Claus. Um, One of the things I should mention, I've talked about the wild hunt. That happens, mythologically speaking, it takes place on Halloween, and is one of the foundations behind why you wear a mask on Halloween. The idea behind it is this, that it is the one night of the year where immortals are vulnerable. And so to conceal themselves among mortality, they wear a mask, so that during the wild hunt, they get overlooked because the rule of the hunt is you can hunt with us, you can run, or you can hide. That's pretty much the rules of the hunt. And if you hunt with them, then you take what you kill and you absorb the power of that god or that immortal or that monster. And so and because it's the one time of year, and that's why it's this bridge point between the 31st and the 1st, which then gets you into All Saints Day, because you have this window where the reality between the spirit realm and our mortal realm is very thin. That's why we talk so much about it. And its thinness persists all the way through into the winter solstice, at which point then it transitions out because there's increasing light. But prior to that, from the 31st on to the winter solstice, that boundary, it's why we keep telling ourselves so many scary stories and stuff during the winter time, right? Traditionally, as an anthropologist, it's to occupy the time because you're stuck inside all the time, especially if you're living in the northern hemisphere. You know, during the Middle Ages, you're not going out and playing. There's no heat, there's no warm water anywhere unless you boil it. So, you know, you're telling each other stories and occupying the time. And the point of the stories isn't just to pass the time, it's to teach and educate. It's to preserve something over time. It's not simply the morality play of the hero's journey. I personally believe that a lot of these stories help us remember who we are or who we were, and even Santa Claus. Because if Santa Claus winds up transitioning completely into this blood-soaked guy from Violent Night, which I suspect we'll continue to see. That he's this anti-hero protector who has a dark backstory. You know, like that's the Violent Night story. Like it really leaves you with that. But they nail it so well. Like, see, this is where I'm really here's the question. Who's Odin? This has been the question that I've been asking. Traditionally, I would jump right on it and say Odin is Chesed, because Odin and Zeus and Jupiter traditionally are synonymous. They all have exactly the same role. However, there in modern interpretation, Odin is seen somewhat differently. And the most frustrating aspect for me of that was in Thor Ragnarok, where Odin has an eye patch and the loss of his sight is significant. It wasn't just because like his sister scratched his eye out or something. It was to obtain wisdom, right? So that he had insight and wisdom. That's why he's missing the right eye and he's looking through the left. But they wound up switching that. And so if Thor were to lose an eye, he should mirror his father in my mind, and so the eyes would be similar. I have a couple skeleton bookends that I have that I've shown in the past. I'll show them really quick here. So if so you got these two guys here and they each have an eye patch. And the idea is they look at each other because they mirror each other, right? In who and what they are. They actually mirror them. I got these up at the pier. You know where it is, up at by the Pike Place Market. Yeah. So anyway, it was such a good day. I
The
saw
old shop, maybe?
yes, that's exactly where
Yep,
I got it. I knew
that's the
you
one,
would
yeah.
know. That's why I had to tell you. I knew you would know. I was like, yeah, you know where these are. So these are one of my favorite finds. But the idea in Thor Ragnarok, he loses the same eye. So what they're trying to do is like the father becomes the son becomes the father, and he's now stepped into the all-father role as Thor, which works. But this is where, as you know, that mythological paleontologist, as I'm skimming away at the dirt, it gets a little muddy sometimes as to who's what. Because if Odin winds up working down the pillar of severity, everything becomes super duper easy. Like I don't have to talk about where people work anymore and stuff like that and do the thing. I'm just saying it just straight down, right? He just works his way down. In Violent Night, I really think that that's where they were going. And the reason for this is a traditional weapon of Thor is a hammer. So that would put him on the other side and in Mars, in Gavura, because Thor uses a hammer. Odin doesn't rely on a hammer, he has a spear. So it's different, right? And so in that movie, he winds up getting a really big hammer that reminds him of the hammer he used in the Middle Ages or something. And so he winds up kicking butt on everyone with a sledgehammer. And so in that context, I was like, my heart was singing. I was like, wow, that's a neat reference to Mjolnir, right? And then that would be Thor. Although the first person to have the hammer would have been Odin because he gives it to Thor, right? It's a gift. But there's no record of him ever using it because he has a spear. So, it's so if Santa's Odin and he's riding down the pillar of severity, then that fills that whole warrior thing in the red suit that everyone's really wanting to put him in right now. And I've seen that in more than just one story. There's been a few where Santa's been kind of a badass. The first time, in fact, I rewatched it last night, Red Sleigh Down in South Park. It's where the Cartman is trying to earn enough good boy points to have Santa deliver him a present, but his cousin shows him that he's been so bad he actually owes presents to Santa Claus. So he goes up to the North Pole on the poo-poo train. Spoilers. I'm just ruining the whole episode for you. Anyway, he goes up to the North Pole and he convinces Santa Claus that he should go into the Middle East and they can celebrate Christmas there. And then he gets shot down. And then they waterboard Santa Claus and stuff. It's delightful. It's so wrong on so many levels. But yeah, Red Sleigh Down. So it's like season 6 in South Park. You just Google it. But so he's been a badass for a while because season 6 of South Park, that's decades ago. So that's like 20 years ago. So there's been a movement to have Santa become a bit of a badass. And the fact if he carries anything like an axe or a hammer, well, then that again puts him in the Gavura side because Mars also uses an axe. So because Odin doesn't need that. So that's why these sort of esoteric schmackdowns, you have to be flexible until you can know. And the only way you really would ever know is if we wound up just sitting down with all these Hollywood guys who are making these decisions to retell these stories and go, what's on your mind? And hopefully it's a satisfying answer and not something like this was the way it felt. Because that works too. I honestly believe that not everything has to be on purpose. It seems like human consciousness in the function of creativity works where if you're open, then the story comes and it just comes and it just makes sense and you'll know it's the right story or not the right story.
I
So,
had a thought.
huh?
I had a thought with
Yeah, yeah.
you talking about where he's in the Mars camp, and if, I was thinking, okay, Mars cleaves in two, right? Where Santa has a list. He cleaves in two:
Polars.
the good, the bad, or naughty, nice, right?
Yep, yep.
That was one thing. And I think the first time I kind of noticed the change, if you will, in Tim Allen's The Santa Claus, right? They
Mhm.
actually make reference to it where they're in the boardroom and the new upstarts are like, yeah, we got Santa coming down the road in a Panzer, and he's all upset about it, right? But okay, so some force is changing, and they were just kind of making us aware of that. Okay, we're trying to force this guy into a different camp now. He's not all jolly and everything. He's gonna go, and there's been many movies along the line, and this latest one you referenced is just hit it home for sure. I haven't watched it yet, but just watching the trailer, like, wow, yeah, he's full on
Mhm.
taking it. I'm like, that's not the claymation, the Santa, or the idea of you know fellowship and giving and all that aspect. They're like, no, that's out the window now. We got this different thing going on. Like, so like, well, is that a good thing or bad thing? And that's debatable, I guess. But I have noticed that.
I am so glad you mentioned the Tim Allen movies because there is a key element in there that you don't quite see in any other story, and that is that Santa Claus becomes Santa Claus when he puts on the suit. That's your best evidence in storytelling that Santa Claus then could be Jupiter and not Mars. The narrative association is uh, Joseph and Esau. Um, in order to or Isaac, I'm sorry, yeah, Abraham, Joseph and Esau. Yes, uh,
Jacob and Esau,
Jacob and Esau.
when he
Thank you.
puts on the fur,
Yeah, yeah,
are you
yeah. He
talking about?
puts on the fur, right? And so it's Jacob and Esau, and he puts on the fur of his brother so that he can then pass as him. It's this whole wearing the mantle, and in that case, Esau's hairy, right? Hairy hero, so he's Mars, and he's red. Esau means red. So and he's hairy. So the red hairy guy and his mother, Jacob's mother says, "Hey, let's put this on and your blind dad won't know the difference," which was Isaac. So and so my thought is in the movie The Santa Claus, the fact that Santa is mortal but then he puts on the suit and he becomes Santa, like it enchants him physically until he dies. And he's immortal basically until he falls off a building or some stupid death, right? So but that leads me to believe again that it's I work over here, but I live over there. So again, so putting on the suit means he looks like that guy, but he's not acting like that guy. Although he is using a lot of that guy's tools, like I have a naughty nice lift, which is a straight up Mars thing, just as you said, straight up polarization. You go on this side, you go on that side. They have a beautiful example of that in that movie, by the way. Violent Night. It's just beautifully done, where he pulls out the scroll and it's all magical. This is very cool. But so yeah, I think if not for the Tim Allen movie, I'd really not be too sure that it's Odin. I'd want to put him on the other, but the idea of it's the suit, and the idea of that suit seems to carry on. Like he's not really Santa Claus until he puts the suit on, and then he's Santa Claus. Otherwise, it's just a fat guy with a beard. So, all the other things that tie Santa to being himself are magical instruments, that are applied to him. The bag of holding, which has infinite capacity, the sled of being everywhere, right? The eight reindeer of infinite locality, Rudolph being able to part any distance, right? With the red nose, he's able to do that. And why would Rudolph then, that ties him back, Rudolph being a red name, right? Rudolph's origin is a redness. So the idea of him then being tied to Wep-Wawit, which was the opener of ways, which led the way for the king in his hunting party. So you get that same thing. It's just different cultures with different dynamics describing a lot of the same kind of elements. And then when you pull it all together, you get in your head a bigger picture of what it is. So yeah, I'm looking forward to next year because we're gonna do Esoteric Smackdown, but I realize we need to start real ground level. Like we're just gonna talk about the solar system and just basic stuff, and then we'll work our way up and we'll use the tree of life as our tool to help us remember where everything is, because I was just going through another piece last night, and it was just looking at why so many cultures have seven divinities that seem to be running the show. And I'm like, well, there's the tree of life right there. There's seven key divinities, which are seen in Egypt. They're seen in the Vedic text in Hindi culture. They're seen in all through Asia, actually, in the Middle East, all through Sumer, right? So seven key gods there. Almost every pantheon has seven key gods, and it's ties us back to the tree. So if we can look at those gods, look at what they use, look at the symbols that are tied to them, then we can begin to build for ourselves a link list of correspondences so that it just keeps getting bigger. And then suddenly you'll be like, oh, and the light will go on, and it's the most amazing feeling because you'll start seeing and understanding why certain things are there, not just seeing them there, but being like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Of course, that character would have a hammer, or of course, and then you'll be able to, like, as the story unfolds, expect certain things. It's very rewarding when you're watching and you're like, boy, I bet you this guy is going to have this happen to him. And then sure enough, oh yeah, they're telling that story. Okay, cool, so that's cool. And other linkages, um, they're just fun. I think of comic books and characters like Spider-Man and stuff, and that eventually all of this esoteric schmackdowning gets into the egregores, which are created by those universes, because each of them are supplying us meaningful characters for instance, most people on planet Earth probably know and appreciate Luke Skywalker better than Jesus Christ. That may seem, like really, whoa, really? Back in the 80s, I think everyone would have been losing their mind if I dared say that. But today, probably not. And it's because Luke Skywalker, at least he used to stand for, all sorts of really amazing stuff. He was the solitary hero, that stood against the thing. Anyway, so that's the significant part of Santa Claus, that I just wanted to touch on. There's more. The use of a candy cane is really cool. I noticed Gypsy had mentioned the candy cane, eggnog, and Eucharists. The candy cane, the red striping on the candy cane reminds me of what you would see in a barber shop in medieval times. And keep in mind, a barber wasn't just the guy who cut your hair. He pulled your teeth. He dealt with abscesses. He sewed you up if you were cut. I mean, he was basically an all-around doctor. But he wasn't a doctor. So, and you would know that they were in business when they would wrap the red cloth around the white pole. And what most people don't know is that that was from the blood gathered from bleeding people, right? Because, they had too many humors. So they had to let the blood out, and then they would wrap people's wrists in these cloths, and then they would dry okay, it's the Middle Ages. How did we ever survive? That's all I can say. Like, when you read about it, you're just like, how did we not die of infection all the time at every last instant? Because dang. But
Well, I
anyway,
did sometimes.
yeah, well, a lot of
Truth
times,
be told, yeah,
probably, right? A whole bunch of times, likely.
about 1200 something,
Yeah,
at
so.
least in Europe.
Yeah, and just, oh my goodness. So history's still my favorite topic. It's nothing but stories. Who doesn't like that if it's taught right? Well, thank you for hanging out with me. I'm glad. I'm glad we got to get through this. There's a lot. I wish Horace was able to have shown. I would have really enjoyed his input. So,
Yeah,
uh,
for sure.
yeah, it's a busy time of year right now. So, yep. Anything else you want to add?
No, I made my points that the
Yeah.
things that popped into my head and like, oh yeah, that, and just like I say, as soon as you start getting it, it goes, oh, lines right up. So that makes sense. I like the whole sleigh and eight reindeer, and I was thinking of like the chariot, or
Mhm.
in in sci-fi, we've talked about this before, where it's the TARDIS, right?
Yeah.
Where anywhere, any place, and anytime or anytime, right? So kind of the same idea, and I really like the space in between the. How did you phrase that?
Oh, the space in between the spaces.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Because and it brought up was that Anaximander, I think, where they were trying to mathematically, if the turtle is going halfway to the destination, you'll never get there, right? Because there's an infinite number of spaces
Oh, right.
if you
Yes.
always go
Yes. I know what you're talking
halfway.
about. Yes. Yes. I know what you're talking
I
about.
don't know if that's the right guy, but it's one of the ancient Greeks, and it was a puzzle.
Yes.
It's like the paradox. It's a paradox, right? Where if
Where
you
you
always go
divide the distance in half each time, and no
each
matter,
time, you'll never
you'll
get
never
there.
get there. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
we
impossible.
studied that in uh, infinite series
Mhm.
mathematics. I think it was 227 or physics 227, 220. I can't remember.
Right on.
Anyway, yeah, and then of course in philosophy class too, where
When you get
we,
that really nice logarithmic curve,
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
never
asymptotic,
approaches
yeah, and
zero,
you're like, you never get there. Sorry,
never get to
get
zero.
real close, quick. But yeah, but there's always space in
Yeah.
there. There's always, no matter how far you go or how close you get, there's always some space to work with. So that was kind of a cool thing, I thought.
Oh my God.
Anyway, thanks, Aubrey.
Oh yeah.
That was awesome.
Thanks. I
Are we
really,
charged up for Christmas? Yeah,
I
Santa.
know. I'm soaked. I'm ready to go. So hopefully it's a good Christmas will be fun. I'm excited. So getting together with the family, all that fun stuff. Well, Merry
Yeah.
Christmas to everyone out there who wasn't able to come. And next year is going to be awesome. We're gonna have lots and lots and lots. By the way, I have been working on the collections library, and I literally went through each collection and then reordered them because for whatever reason they were all jumbled around, and not in any kind of good sequence. Where if you were like trying to take a class, you couldn't. Now you can. So they're
Cool.
right in order, all of them. I figured that way, then everyone over Christmas, if they get bored, they can always check it out. And then we added 3 new categories in there, specific ones, which I think will be fun and get us ready for next year.
Right
So,
on.
all right. We'll see you guys later. Thanks again, Parks.
Thanks.
Talk to you
Merry
later.
Christmas.
You too. Bye.